Hey folks, in today's lecture we are going to finish off our look at repetition. And so today we're doing part 4 of repetition and we're going to look at for loops. So let's get started. For loops are used when you know how many times you want to do something up front. So let's review. We've dealt with while loops and we've dealt with do while loops. And in both of those cases, there's a condition that the while loop is checking each time it goes through, whether it's at the top with a while loop or at the bottom with a do while loop. But that condition will be checked each time that you go through the loop, and it will either be true or false. As long as it's true, the loop keeps going, and whenever it's false, the loop stops. This is very useful, and there are a lot of loops where you want to do something until some condition is true. But there are also sometimes that you just need to do something 10 times. And this happens so often that you kind of end up rewriting the same block of code many different times. And so if we take a look at this block of code here, we start off with count equals 0, and count is equal to 0 up here, and so that creates a variable. And then we have a while loop that says while count is less than 10, we're going to keep doing the loop. And of course, the loop starts there and ends there. So this loop is just printing out the count, which of course is going to print out a 0, and then a 1, and then a 2, and then a 3, all the way up until we get to 9. 9 is still less than 0, so when it checks 9 less than 0, life is good and you'll still go, it'll print the 9. But then when it adds 1 to it, count is now 10, it gets back up to the top of the loop, and 10 is not less than 10, so it stops. So effectively, this loop would print out 0 through 10. And the reality is, you actually end up doing loops that are like this a lot. And so it turns out they have given us a shortcut for doing this same loop. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy this code in here. So I had in count equals 0, and I had while count is less than 10, we're going to print count, and then we're going to count plus plus. All right, I'm just going to get rid of this hello world, and I'm going to run it. And as expected, we're going to see 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and then the loop is going to stop. But again, this happens so often that there's actually a shortcut for this. Now, it's a really weird looking shortcut, but it is a shortcut nonetheless. So let's take a look at a for loop. A for loop has the same 3 things that were going on in my while loop. It just puts them all together on a single line. So this is the syntax of a for loop. And again, if you're looking at this and saying, ugh, this looks scary, it is a little scary, but it's really not that bad. Okay, so let's take a look at the 3 parts. The first part is what I'm circling here, which is setting up a variable, so int I, and setting it equal to 0. The second part is the test in the while loop, while I is less than 10. And then the third part is where you actually change the value of I. And so effectively, it just puts the 3 parts together on one line. And then inside of here, we have the print I. Okay, so I'm going to go back over to the replit window where we already have code. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to write this exact same thing in there. So int I equals 0. That's the first thing. That part of the for loop is equivalent to this part. Now I happen to call it count up above and I'm calling it I down here. I could absolutely call it I could absolutely call it count. It doesn't matter. It's just a variable name. So the first thing that happened is the equivalent to this line 3. The second thing that's going to happen is the part that's highlighted there, which is the while statement. And so I'm going to say while I is less than 10. And I'm using I again because I'm just happening to pick I. And then the last part is what's happening on line 6, where I'm changing the counter each time through the loop. And so we're saying I plus plus. And then I just have my curly braces like normal. And in here, I'm going to system.out.println I, because that's my variable name. And we are good to go. So when I run this, the first while loop is going to print 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And then the for loop is going to do the exact same thing again. And so we're going to get another 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. All right. And just to prove a couple of things, for int count equals 0, count less than 10, count plus plus is the same variable name as the earlier one. I'm going to get an error right now because I already have a count, so I'm going to delete the original one. But now I'm going to system.out.println count, and you can see this is going to print out the same 0 to 9, just like the other loop did. Okay, so the variable name does not matter. All that matters is there has to be 3 parts inside of this for loop. They're separated by semicolons, just like you would at the end of a line, and they're inside a set of parentheses. So you start off with the word for, you're going to have parentheses, you're going to have the initialization, the test, the thing that you're checking, and then the increment is what we call the last part, which is where we're adding 1 to the count each time through the loop, or adding 1 to the I in that case. Because this is done so often, by convention, you frequently call the variable I. There's no reason that you have to do that. I is short for index, and it's just, you will see a lot of for loops will use I as their variable. You'll sometimes see ones that use a J or a K, and that's because they already used I somewhere else. But in this case, we're using I. In this case, we're using count. It works the same way. All 3 of the things that are in here, separated by semicolons, must be there. One of them sets up the variable, one of them is the while condition effectively, and the other one is what's changing the variable each time through the loop. All right, so this is just breaking that down for us. For int I equals 0, this sets up a variable, can be any name. I less than 10, this is the test. Just like in the while condition, as long as this is true, we're going to keep going. And then I++, this is what's changing the I each time through the loop. All right, so let's trace one of these guys. So we start off with class main, public static void main. All right, when we go into the loop, the first thing that's going to happen is it creates an I variable. Initially, the I variable is set equal to 0 because that's what I told it to do at the beginning over here. All right, so my I variable is 0 because I told it to, and then it's going to check the test to make sure that the test is actually true. So it checks to see if 0 is less than 5, which it is. So it says, okay, we're good to go. All right, so since 0 is less than 5, we're going to go into the loop, and that's going to cause it to print out I. Now, it's slightly weird. The first time through the loop, the thing that's going to happen is the first part. But on every subsequent trip through the loop, the thing that's going to happen is the last part. Because you only initialize the variable once, and that's the very first time you go through the loop. Every other time you're going through the loop, you're going to do the increment, not the initialization. So weirdly, this part is ignored the first time through the loop, and this part is ignored every other time through the loop. So on the second and third and 15th or 100th or however many times we're going to go, the initialization is ignored. And that kind of makes sense. Okay, so again, I is currently 0. 0 was less than 5, so we went into the loop. That caused it to print out the 0. So now we're going to move on to the next line. Well, the next line is the closing curly brace for the loop. That's the curly brace that matches this one. So when we hit the bottom of the loop, what happens is the increment happens, and then we recheck the test at the top. So the I is changed to 1, and now we check if 1 is less than 5, which it is. So we're going to go in, we're going to print the 1, we're going to hit the bottom of the loop, the I is going to increment again. Now it's 2, 2 is less than 5, so we're going to print a 2, we hit the bottom of the loop, back to the top, the I increments to 3, 3 is less than 5, we print, we back to the bottom, we're back up to the top, we increment I is equal to 4, we're printing 4, we're back at the bottom. All right, now the interesting one is this time. We're going to go back to the top, I gets incremented to 5, but 5 is not less than 5. So at this point, the for loop is done, and it's going to skip over to the end of the main and eventually the end of the program because it has completed. So as soon as this test that's in here is false, that test being the thing I highlighted in purple, as soon as that is false, the loop stops. Just like in the case with the while loop, where we had while I is less than 5 or while count is less than 5, it is the same exact test that you would write. So again, all a for loop is, it's a shortcut for writing a while loop that happens to go a set number of times. So why do you have both of these loops? So at this point, we've seen 3 loops. We've seen a while loop, we've seen a do-while loop, and we have now seen a for loop. And I've told you at each point, you can actually code any one of them with any other one of them. While loops and for loops are really equivalent because you can convert one to the other and back and forth. Do-while loops take a little bit of trickiness in order to convert them into while loops or into for loops, but it is possible. It's always possible. All three things could replace each other. Having said that, there are types of loops that are more suited to one type or another. If you know how many times you're going to go through something, you're going to want to use a for loop. If you don't know how many times you're going to go through because it's based on some condition, but you think you're going to have to go at least once, you should do a do-while loop, and in all other cases, you should do a while loop. So that's the way that you're going to decide which one. If you know how many times, for. If you know it's at least once, but you don't know how many times, do while. And if you don't know either of those things, while. All right, so that's why all three of them exist. Each of them is more elegant in one way or another. And if you look at this is the exact same code. This is functionally equivalent code. In both cases, it prints out the same actual answer. But the one on the right is a lot neater. Now, I will say it's a little bit more confusing because you have to remember the order in which you're going to write the various bits into that for statement. But once you get used to this shortcut, it's really not that bad. And again, it's because this is the same as this, and this is the same as this, and finally, this is the same as this. And then, obviously, ultimately, these two are the same. They're just print statements. So all the same code is there on the screen. It's all in one line in the for loop, whereas it's on three separate lines with the while loop. And so that's why the for loop exists. It's a nice, clean way of writing the same code. And again, really only useful. For loops are only useful when you know how many times you want to go through the loop. All right, so let's do a couple of examples. We're going to prompt the user for 10 numbers, and then we're going to figure out which of the numbers they gave us was the lowest number, and we're going to print out that lowest value. All right, so this is a little bit tricky. This is probably one of the first programs that we've done that if you pause and you try to write this, you're probably going to have a little bit of a hard time doing this. So the first part is to prompt the user for 10 numbers. That's pretty easy. That sounds to me like a loop. Since we're specifically asking for 10 numbers, sounds to me like that should be a for loop. So we're going to start off. I'm going to pause the video again. I'm going to set up the scanner just so that you don't have to watch me type that again. Okay, so this is a fresh replit. I have imported scanner and created a scanner object the same as we always do. So what we're supposed to do is we're supposed to ask the user to enter in a number. And we're supposed to do this 10 times. So we're going to use our new whiz-bang for loop. So we're going to say for int, and I'm going to call my variable I equals 0, I less than 10, I plus plus. So starting with I is 0, each time through the loop we're going to add 1 to I, and then we are going to keep going as long as I is less than 10, which means it'll be 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, which is 10 times because of the 0. All right, then we need our curly braces, and that print statement should be inside the loop because I wanted to actually print that every single time through the loop. All right, so now I'm going to read in the number that they gave me, and I'm just going to store that in a variable called num, and we define it outside, and I'm going to say num is equal to myscan.nextInt. Okay, so nothing wild and crazy there so far. So just to prove the point that that is working, I'm going to go ahead and run it. And what I would expect to happen is it's going to ask me for a number. I'm going to type one in, and it's going to do that 10 times, and then it's going to end. And I need to move the window. Okay, and that seems to be about 10 times, and it looks like it did the right thing. Okay, now what we were supposed to do is we were supposed to look for the lowest number that they gave me. All right, so how are we going to do that exactly? Well, we're going to have to keep track of what the min value is. So I'm going to create another variable called min. And basically what I'm going to do is as I go through the loop, I'm going to say if the number that they gave me, which is called num, is less than min, then I'm going to change min to be equal to that num. And so effectively, as I'm going through the loop, it's just going to keep updating min. Well, the only problem that I have with this is what do I start min off as? Because if I set min equal to 0, which might be your first guess, then that's going to create a problem. And so I'm going to run the program and I'm just going to demonstrate the problem. So I set min equal to 0, and each time through the loop I check to see if the number they gave me is less than min. So 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, and 100. It says, well, it would have been helpful if I'd printed out the min, which is what I meant to do after the for loop. All right, so I'm going to run this again. And the problem is that it's going to print out 0. And that's because I set the min equal to 0, and even though I never actually entered in 0 here, it still says the min is 0, but that's incorrect, obviously. So what I need to do is I need to set min to a very large number. So you might say 999999999. Okay, and that will basically work. The problem with that is if they start entering in numbers that are greater than 9999999, so 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, and 100, it says the minimum is 10, which is correct. But if I were to type in a number that was greater than 99999, then all of a sudden it won't. If all the numbers were greater than that, it'll tell me that the correct answer is that, when in reality it isn't. So there's a magical thing called integer, and this is not something we've covered before. Integer dot max value. Okay, and you can tell that this is all in capital letters, and if you remember back to a couple of weeks ago, anything that's in capital letters is in capital letters because it's a constant. So really what this number is I'm setting min, the variable called min, to the highest possible number that can be stored in an integer. I don't have to remember what that number is, I just say use this constant. And so now we're going to run it, and we're actually going to try some real numbers. So 52, let's do 781. I'm just typing random characters on the screen in case that's not clear. And 17. And it says the min is 7, and that looks correct. Okay, so effectively what happened is, at the very beginning, it set min to 2.5 billion, give or take. That's the highest value you can store in an integer. And then it said, okay, we're going to do this 10 times. So it created an I variable, and it set the I variable equal to 0, and while it's less than 10, it's going to add 1 to it each time through the loop. It asks me for a number, it reads in the number, and so I typed in 52, and it said, is 52 less than 2.5 billion? And the answer, of course, is yes. So it changes min to now be equal to 52. We're at the bottom of the loop, I increments, so I is now 1, and we go back up to the top, and now we're going to ask for another number, and that's what's happening here. This time the user typed in 7. Well, the current value of min is 52. So the if statement says if 7 is less than 52, which it is, min is now equal to 7. Great. We hit the bottom of the loop, I increments up to 2, and 2 is still less than 10, so it asks me to enter in a number. I type in the number, and this time I typed in 81. So it says, is 81 less than 7? Well, it's not, so it doesn't change min. So we get to the bottom of the loop, we go back up at the top, and min is still 7. And you can see the same thing's going to happen in all the other ones. It's going to see, is 50 less than 7? Is 20 less than 7? Is 35 less than 7? None of those are less than 7. And so when the loop ends, min is equal to 7, which is what we would have expected. So this one was a little tricky, mostly because of that understanding that you'd need to set the min to a really high number, and you'd probably have struggled with what number exactly. Max value is not something we talked about before, but that's a handy little trick. There's also a min value, which would be negative 2.5 billion if you were trying to do something similar, but in the other direction. All right, and as usual, there's some code that is pretty similar to what I just typed, and that does the same thing. Okay, so next up, we're going to use loops in order to print out a shape. Now, here's a circumstance where we're going to use a loop inside of another loop. And that's something that we talked briefly about in one of the other sessions. But let me reiterate that there's no rule that says you cannot put a loop inside another loop, just like you can put an if statement inside another if statement. As a matter of fact, you can have an if statement inside a loop inside an if statement. They can be nested in any arbitrary way. And furthermore, it doesn't have to be one type of loop. I could have a while loop with a for loop inside it, or a while loop with a do while loop inside it, or any combination of any of the above. So it's possible to have one thing inside of another, and you're going to see as we code this example why that might be necessary. So what we're trying to do here is we're going to ask the user how many rows they would like and how many columns they would like. And whatever number they give me, I'm going to draw that many of the pound sign. So for example, if they tell me they want 3 rows and 2 columns, I'm going to print out 2 columns times 3 rows of pound signs. If they tell me 10 by 10, it'll be a big square, and so on and so forth. Okay, so same thing as before. I'm going to pause for just a moment and create a new replit with the scanner. Okay, so here's a fresh replit with a scanner imported as always. So let's talk about how we would go about solving this problem. So there are kind of 2 things that are happening here. The first is that I'm supposed to print out some number of columns of the pound sign. And then I'm supposed to do that some number of rows. So we're going to start off and we're going to ask the user how many rows they want and how many columns do you want. So let's do that. How many rows? And we're going to read in a variable called rows. myscan.nextInt. And then we're going to how many columns. And we're going to do myscan.nextInt. Great. Okay, so let's only deal with the columns for just a moment. So if they tell me they want 7 columns, effectively I need to 7 times print out a pound sign on a single line. So that sounds to me like a for loop. So I'm going to say for int I equals 0, I less than columns. So I don't know what the number is that the user is going to give me, but once they give me that number, I do know how many times I'm going to go, and that's columns. So I'm just saying I is equal to 0, I is less than whatever number they tell me. If they tell me 6, then I'm going to go I less than 6. And then the last part is usually the I++. So I'm just going to print out system.out.print a single pound sign. And I'm using a print, not a print line, because I don't want a carriage return after each one. I want them all on the same line. All right, so I'm going to run the program right now. This is not going to do the final answer, but it's going to get me half of the way there. So it's going to ask me how many rows, and it's going to ignore whatever I type into that. So I'm going to say 10 rows. Doesn't really matter. But then it's going to ask me how many columns, and for that I'm going to say 8. So again, columns is now equal to 8 when I hit enter. So this is going to do a for loop. It's going to set I as a variable equal to 0, and it's going to say while 0 is less than 8. It's going to print a pound sign, it's going to change I to 1, and then it's going to see if 1 is less than 8, which it is. So it's going to print a pound sign, and then it's going to change I to 2, and then it's going to do 2 less than 8, yes it is, print. And it's going to keep doing that until I gets incremented to 8, and then 8 less than 8 is false, so it's going to come out of the loop. So this is going to give me 8 pound signs on a line, and if we count them out there, it's a little hard to see in that window, but there are 2, 4, 6, 8 pound signs, as we would expect. So this is how we get the number of columns. But how do we get the number of rows? Well, for each one of those columns, I need to do that over and over again. So this is the confusing part. I'm going to need an outer for loop that wraps around this other for loop. So I'm going to say for, and I have to use a different variable name here, so I'm going to say j equals 0, j less than rows, j++. And then inside that for loop, I'm going to put the other for loop. Now, why am I doing it this way? Well, the answer is I want this inner for loop to happen as many times as there are rows. This is how many the rows is read into rows, and this outer loop is going to go from 0 until the number of rows. But each time through, I want to do the same thing for the inner one. If I run this right now, it's still not exactly right, but we're almost there, and I'm going to show you what's going to happen. So I'm going to say I want a 10 by 10. And what we would expect is I would have 10 rows and 10 columns. But what I'm actually going to get is 100 pound signs on a line by itself. And the reason is because after every 10th, I need to put in a carriage return. So specifically where that needs to happen is at the end of the inner for loop. So I'm going to do a system.out.println, and I'm just going to print nothing, effectively a open close print like that. But it's a print line, not a print. The print doesn't put the carriage return in, whereas the print line does. So now when I say I want a 10 by 10, it's going to give me a square. 10 rows, 10 columns, and there is effectively a square. There's 10 pound signs, and there should be 10 rows if you count them out. Okay, so let's talk about how this is working. So nothing magical is happening here. It's just reading in rows and columns into a variable. So far, that's all very simple. The only real magic is happening with these nested for loops. And the reason that they're nested is because this for loop is inside of the curly braces of the other for loop. And that means that effectively what's going to happen is j is going to be set equal to 0. And j is going to stay 0 while this entire loop happens. And that entire loop is going to print out that line, the first line over there. When that loop is done, it prints out a carriage return, which is what brings us back to the beginning of the next line. And then we reach the bottom of the outer loop and j becomes 1. J is going to stay 1 while this entire highlighted inner loop runs, which is going to print out this line. And then we're going to print a carriage return, and then we're going to do the third one and the fourth one and the fifth one. So the outer loop is controlling the rows, while the inner loop is controlling the columns. And that's giving me a box of whatever size I want. And just to prove the example on the slides, we asked for 2 columns and 3 rows, and we should end up with something that looks the same as we did on the slide. 3 rows, 2 columns, and there it is. And if I do it the other way around, where I give it 2 rows and 3 columns, then we'll end up with a stubbier but wider picture. 2 rows, 3 columns. You can see I have 2 rows with 3 columns on it. So if you're wondering what is the point of this program, there really is none. It's just to give you an example that proves a couple of things. First off, for loops can be based upon a variable instead of always being less than 10. There's no reason that it has to always be less than 10. The second thing is that it is possible to put one loop inside of another loop. And again, that's something we briefly mentioned in one of the earlier videos, but I just wanted to show another example of it where you can do that in here. Okay, and there's the code, pretty much the same as what I did, although I used I, the outside loop, and J for the inside loop, unlike what I did on the replit where I called them the other way around. But the variable names do not matter as long as you're consistent. All right. So I'm just going to do another quick example here, and this time I'm going to just make a new replit. And the reason I'm making new replits for each of these is because, remember, you can pause the video at any time and you can grab the URL that's up here in the bar, and if you typed that in to your browser, you would be able to see the same code that I have, and you would be able to fork it and play with it yourself, change the code around, run it, and see how it runs in any way that you want. All right, so I just want to show you one more thing with the for loop. Every time that we've done one, we have said I equals 0 as the first thing, and we've said I plus plus as the last thing. But that doesn't always have to be true. And I'm just going to do for I equals 100, I greater than 0, I minus minus this time. And I'm just going to print I. Okay, so the same components are here, but instead of starting with I equal to 0, in this case, I'm starting with I equal to 100. And then my condition is while I is greater than 0, and the thing that I'm doing is I'm changing I by making it smaller each time rather than making it bigger each time. So I'm doing this the other way around. What this is going to do is it's going to print 100 down to 1. So 199, 98, all the way down to 1. And I just wanted to point this out because in most of the examples that you've seen, it's always been an I++ here, but that doesn't always have to be the case. And likewise, in all the examples you've seen, it has always been I equals 0 here, and that doesn't have to be the case. As a matter of fact, it can be even more complicated than just a minus minus. I could say minus equal 3. And so now instead of printing 100, 99, 98, it'll print 100, 97, 94, 91, and work its way down by 3 each time, printing only the third one every time. And there you go. So just going up to the top, 197, 94, 91. Likewise, minus equal 2, or 5, and it's going to go down by 5. You'll get 100, 95, 80, 90, 85, 80, 75, 70, and so on and so forth. So there's no rule that says this is always just I++. And there's no rule that says it's even I++ or I-. It can be any math you want to do. And in some cases, each of those things would be useful. And likewise, the initialization doesn't always have to start off with I equals 100. It can actually start off with anything you want. Okay, so we're going to do one more example, and that is with regard to a calculator. So this one's going to be a pretty complicated example, and I'm doing it as the last one in here because it utilizes a lot of the different things that we have seen. So what we're going to do is we're going to write a program which prompts the user with a menu. The menu is going to say 1 to add numbers, 2 to multiply numbers, or 3 to quit. And we're going to keep coming back to that menu over and over again until they hit quit. But after they tell us that they want to add numbers, we're going to ask them how many numbers do they want to add, and then we're going to read in that many numbers, add them together, and spit back out a result. And the same is going to happen when they choose to multiply numbers. We're going to ask them how many numbers they want to multiply, and then we're going to keep reading in the numbers until we get there. So let's talk about the steps of doing this. So we'll need an outer loop that runs the menu. And it seems like we would use a do while there, because we're going to show them the menu at least once, but we don't know how many times we're going to show them the menu. They may run the program 1 time, they may run the program 100 times. I have no real way of knowing. So I'm going to give them a do while loop, which will at least one time show them the menu, and then allow them to go back and do it again and again and again if they want to. So again, I'm going to pause. I'm going to make a new replet. And in that new replet, I'm going to create the scanner because, again, we're going to need a scanner. So just going to save you a little time here. Okay, so we're going to solve this problem in little chunks. We're going to begin with the menu, which gives them the 1 add numbers, 2 subtract or multiply numbers, and 3 quit. So that's just print statements, right? So I'm going to print out what would you like to do? And then I'm going to print out the menu. So system.out.println, 1 add numbers, system.out.println, 2 multiply numbers, and 3 quit. Okay, so that's the menu, but I'm going to do this menu over and over again. So I'm going to do a do loop at the top. All of these statements are going to be inside that do loop. And again, I'm just going to highlight them and hit tab in order to move them all over at once. And then the closing curly brace for the do loop, I'm going to line it up with the do loop here. And then I'm going to add in my while. So the while is going to be while they don't give me number 3. So I'm going to call it user input, which I haven't defined that yet. But while the user input is not equal to 3, we're going to keep going around the loop. All right, so I need to actually read in the user input. Int user input. You have to define it outside the loop. I can't define it in there because it won't recognize it in the while loop otherwise. So up at the top here, I'm going to type int user input. All right, so user input is equal to myscan.nextInt. All right, and that reads that in. So we're just going to run this, and what we're going to see is it's going to print out the menu, and as long as I don't hit 3, it's going to keep printing out the menu. So there's a 1, there's a 2, there's a 4. It doesn't really care if it's not even a real number, and there's a 3, and when I hit 3, the program quits. So at least that part is working. All right, so that's my outer loop. I specifically coded that first before I thought about the inner loop because they seem like they're two unrelated problems. The inner loops that we're going to have are pulling in numbers from the user and adding them together. So I want to be careful that I don't want to confuse myself when I'm coding that. So you want to think about one thing at a time. All right, so I now need an if statement. If they gave me a 1 or a 2, I'm supposed to do something in particular. So if user input is equal to 1, we're going to do one thing, and then I'm just going to go ahead and put in, so I don't forget, user input equal 2 is the other possibility, and this one's going to be when they multiply numbers. And I'm just going to give myself a comment up here, adding numbers. All right, and I'm doing that just so that I remember what those are. So when user input is 1, we're adding numbers. When user input is 2, we're multiplying numbers. All right, in both cases, I'm supposed to ask them how many numbers are they going to give me. How many numbers do you want to add? And then I'm going to read in, we'll call it num numbers, which is maybe not a great name, myscan.nextInt. So I'm reading in how many numbers they want. And I'm going to do the same thing down in the multiply section because it works the same down there. So I'm going to ask them how many numbers do they want to multiply instead of add. All right, so now that they've told me that they want to add 5 numbers together, I now need something that's going to go 5 times if they told me 5 numbers, or 3 times if they told me 3 numbers, or 9 times if they told me 9 numbers. So I need a loop, and the question is, which kind of loop am I going to use? Well, I could do a while loop, I could do a do-while loop, and both of those would work, but it seems like I will know by the time I get to this line how many times I'm going to go, so I'm going to use a for loop. So I'm going to say for int I equals 0, I less than num numbers, I plus plus. All right? And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to ask them to give me a number. I'm going to read in that number, and I'm going to add it to a sum. So I need to start off and define a sum. I'm actually going to do that outside this loop because, no, I'm not. Int sum equals 0. Okay, so inside of here, I'm going to say sum plus equals whatever number they gave me, which is myscan.nextInt. Now that's a little tricky. I'm putting 2 things together there, but again, we've been through a lot of examples, so I hope by now some of this is starting to get routine. So all this is doing is reading in a number. That's not particularly crazy. And normally you would assign that to a variable, and then you would have another statement that adds that onto the sum. And you could absolutely do that. I could break that up into 2 statements, but this is just a shortcut for that. And just to prove that this could work a different way, I'm going to say int next num equals myscan.nextInt, and then I'm going to change this to sum plus equals next num. Both of those would work. They are both equivalent statements. I'm just combining the 2 so that I don't need to create a variable called next num, but it works either way. Okay, so to review, we have a for loop. The for loop starts at 0, and it's going to go up to the number of numbers, whatever that is. They're going to tell me how many numbers they want to do. It's going to ask the user to give me a number. It's going to read it in, and it's going to add it to the sum. At the end of this loop, I'm just going to tell them their answer. Your sum is, and then plus sum, the value of the variable sum. Okay, so we're going to run this and we're going to test it just for the adding numbers. We haven't coded the multiply numbers yet, so we're just going to do add numbers. So I'm going to hit 1, and you can see we're here on the code. It's asking me how many numbers do I want to add. Notice it has already created a sum and set it equal to 0. So I'm going to say I want to add 3 numbers, and it says, okay, give me a number. So now we're inside this for loop. I equals 0, I less than 3, because that's what I typed in, I plus plus. So it's saying, give me a number, and it's waiting for me to type in the first number. So I'm going to type in 10, asks for another number because we go back around to the top. So sum should now be equal to 10. So I'm now going to do 20. So sum should now be equal to 30. And I'm going to type in 30, and sum is now going to be equal to 60. And so you see we get your sum is 60. And then because this was an if statement, all of this was an if statement, it realizes that it's not going to do the else if because it's already done the if. So it moves on past the end of the else if, which is down here. And that's going to send me back to the top of the loop. And the top of the loop is going to check and see whether or not, at the bottom of the loop, we're going to check and see if the input is not 3, which it isn't. So we're going to come back up and present them with the menu again. So this seems like this works. So next up, what I need to do is I need to do the exact same thing for multiply numbers with one difference. So I'm going to say int product is what I'm going to call my variable here. And I'm going to set it equal to 1. And the reason I can't set it equal to 0 is because when I'm adding numbers together, I need to start off at 0 and add the numbers to 0. But when I'm multiplying numbers together, if I start off with 0, I would end up with 0 because anything times 0 is 0. So I'm going to set product equals to 1. And then I'm going to use my for loop. So I'm going to say for int I equals 0, I less than num numbers. And then I'm going to do I++. And we're going to ask them to type in a number. Give me a number. And then we're going to read in, we're going to just do product times equals, so I'm just doing it the other way, the way I did it for the first time, myscan.nextInt. So you can see that these are two different ways of doing the same thing. One uses an intermediate variable, and the other one just directly does it. Times equals multiplies one by another, whereas plus equals adds one to another. All right, and then at the end of my for loop, I just need to tell them what the product is. System.out.println, your product is plus product. All right, and so let's run this and let's see where we are. All right, so we're going to do multiply numbers. I'm going to tell it to multiply 3 numbers together, and I'm going to multiply 5 times 5 times 5. And it says that's 125. And that seems right. 5 times 5 is 25, times 5 is 125. All right, so just going to move that window over a little bit. Now I'm going to tell it I want to add numbers, and I'm going to say I want to add 5 numbers, and they are 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And it says, well, the sum of those is 15. And just to prove that things still work, I'm going to do multiply numbers. I'm going to say 2 numbers, 10 times 10. And it still says that's 100, which is correct. So now I'm going to hit 3, and the outer loop ends. All right, so what's happening here and why this is such a bigger block of code? This is probably the most complicated block of code you've seen so far. I wanted to show you the process of solving a bigger problem, which is I started off and I just dealt with the menu, which was really this do and the while that's all the way down at the bottom. And I got that working before I moved on to anything else. Then I dealt only with the adding numbers part, and I figured out how to make all that work. And then I dealt with the multiplying numbers part, and I figured out how to make that work. And so you end up with a lot of code, and at a quick glance, this looks very complicated. There's all these crazy things going on in here, but it's actually really not that bad. It's just 3 little problems that are put together into a bigger problem. But as you can see, it's created a kind of a complex program that's actually almost useful. Like, okay, yes, calculators can do this, but if you were wanting to add a bunch of numbers together or multiply a bunch of numbers together, this is not the worst program in the world. So it's an example that shows you a lot of things together. I want to also demystify the fact that there is a loop here that is a do loop, and inside of that do loop, I have if statements, and inside of those if statements, I have a for loop. So there's a for loop inside an if statement, inside a do while loop. And that's all okay. There's no combination that is not allowed. All of that is allowed. And again, I want to reiterate, we indent our code so you can see what's inside of what. Public static void main begins here, and everything inside of it is indented 4 spaces. Until I get to the do, and then everything inside of it is indented now 6 spaces. And then when I get to the if, everything inside of it's 8 spaces, and when I get to the for inside of that, we're actually 10 spaces in. But you can see by just scrolling around in here, it's pretty easy to see what's inside of what, and at the end, it's easy to see where everything closes out. So it's just a bit more visually easy to see what's going on. So that's what's going on in there. That's the last example today in today's class. You have now seen all the different kinds of loops. You've seen while loops, do while loops, and for loops. We've talked about break statements, and we've talked about continue statements. Don't use them too much, but they do come up every now and again. And we've done lots of examples where you've seen examples of me coding each of these. Again, I would strongly recommend that you try to recode these yourself. Without looking at the answer on the slide, try to open up a Replit window or use IntelliJ and see if you can code these yourself, because you should be able to do that, and you're going to be expected to be able to do that later on in this class and in future classes as well, if you continue on down the road with programming, which I hope you do. All right, well, that's the end of the repetition videos, and in the next section, we're going to talk about arrays. So I will see you then.